On April 20th, 2026, I set out from my old house in Alameda, California, and embarked on my cross-country road trip, driving to Milton, Florida. Before I left the Bay Area, there was one more thing I needed to do. I stopped by the boat, Coast Guard Cutter Monroe, where I signed the ventilation duct in the overhead of the welding shop, right next to the names of the other people that have had the job that I had before me. I headed south through Santa Cruz, where I stopped for lunch, and then took the one all the way down south to Santa Barbara via Big Sur. Stopped in Santa Barbara for dinner and slept in the van overnight in the mountains above Santa Barbara, where I could look down across the water. On day 2, I woke up, said goodbye to the Pacific Ocean, and headed east. I headed east past Los Angeles, stopped in Beaumont, California for lunch. There were plenty of good roadside attractions and photo stops to be had on historic Route 66. Crossed the state line to Arizona, where I stopped in Kingman, Arizona for dinner, and camped in the van in the Hualapi Mountains. I found myself stopped at a train crossing and had nothing better to do than to take artsy, long exposure photographs with my van in the foreground. On the morning of day 3, I woke up and headed east, following Route 66 until I branched off and headed north to head to the Grand Canyon. After checking out the Grand Canyon, I headed south to Flagstaff, Arizona, where I got dinner. After dinner, I continued south and got my tires off the pavement on the Bloody Basement off-highway vehicle trail. Stopped, van camped underneath some power lines. On day 4, I woke up underneath the power lines and headed east on the Bloody Basin OHV trail. Everything was going great until 20 miles from the nearest paved road, I heard the distinct hissing noise of both of my front tires going flat at the same time. Only having one full-size spare and no tire plugs, I elected to hike to the top of the nearest little rise about a half a mile away, where I had cell service, and called USAA to get me out of the jam. I then had the pleasure of waiting 9 hours on my little knoll with my book, water bottle, and camp chair to keep me company while the tow truck driver came. If you zoom in closely, you can see the tow truck driver off in the distance. It was a sight for sore eyes when I saw him rounding that corner. Here's my van getting loaded onto the tow truck. The off-road trail itself was insanely difficult, and the van's no slouch, the tires obviously not being up to the task, but watching the tow truck driver drive a fully loaded F650 up the steep and winding corners was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. Some of the corners, when we would come around them, the front right tire and the back left tire would be teetering on the edge of the road due to the radius of the corner. Fortunately, all's well that ends well, and I ended up back in the Phoenix, Arizona discount tire parking lot, where I spent possibly the worst night of the trip. On day 5, I woke up in the morning, not to the sunrise, but instead to the discount tire employees walking by and commenting on my car. I got new tires on all 4 corners and headed off. From Phoenix, I headed northeast to Heber Overgaard, where I got lunch. I made it across the border into New Mexico, and by nightfall I was in Placitas, New Mexico, just north of Albuquerque, where Holden's parents had graciously volunteered to put me up for the night. I managed to time it so that my arrival was on a weekend where Holden and Sienna were both in town, so we got to explore the Albuquerque area together. We went to the Museum of Nuclear History, went to the Tent Rock Slot Canyons, and got to see some awesome geologic formations. I spent all of Saturday and most of Sunday with Holden, Sienna, and Holden's parents, and headed out in the late afternoon of Sunday. I endeavored to drive to the top of Elk Mountain in the Santa Fe National Forest, and the trail was pretty difficult. I took the van up higher than, to my knowledge, the van has ever been, at 11,620 feet. The following morning, when I woke on day 8, the van coughed to life in the sub-freezing temperatures and 50-mile-an-hour winds, and I was on my way. After descending from Elk Mountain, I stopped in Las Vegas, New Mexico for lunch. I continued east, rejoining historic Route 66, and crossed the border into Texas. I got to check out the somewhat famous Cadillac Ranch art installation and left behind some spray paint. I got dinner in Amarillo, Texas, and headed north to the Lake Meredith recreation area, where I bedded down for the night. Day 9, woke up, headed south to Amarillo for lunch once again, and then headed east. I continued east through Oklahoma, got dinner in Arkansas, right across the border from Oklahoma in Fort Smith, and then headed northeast to the Ozark National Forest, where I bedded down for the night. On day 10, I woke up and headed southeast, stopping in Greenville, Mississippi for lunch. Continuing south, by the time I made it to Hazelhurst, Mississippi, it was raining so hard that camping in the van wouldn't have been any fun, so I ended up staying in a hotel. On the final drive day, day 11, I woke up, headed southeast, got lunch in Slidell, Louisiana, and then continued east to Milton, Florida. Finally, in the promised land, my trip was over. All in all, it was a great trip. Me and the van got through the whole thing together, and it was a great reset before starting flight school.